You've spoken frequently about standing for the Constitution, freedom, democracy. So, what actions do you think Americans should take to keep those fundamentals strong?
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's great to have the chance to speak with everybody there and to talk about this really critically important issue. I think here at home, um, one of the most important things we need to do, in my opinion, is we've got to reinvigorate civics education. We've got to reinvigorate education around the Constitution, around um, the history of the founding of our nation. We need to make sure that people recognize and understand, what it really means to be a nation of laws. And we talk about that a lot. We certainly say, and we are a nation of laws, but I think it's important for people to know what that means and to understand, for example, when you look back at the 2020 election, that candidates certainly have the right to challenge results. They do so under state law and under the rules that have been established by the states, and sometimes those cases can go up to federal court. But when the courts have decided, it's over, and we do have to abide by the rulings of the courts. And I think that we do, as we think about democracy overseas and what we're doing to promote democracy around the world, a lot of times people think first of elections, and elections are obviously crucial. They're absolutely necessary for democracy, but they're not sufficient. We have to ensure that we're supporting the rule of law, that we're supporting a free press, that we are supporting all of those aspects of what is necessary, what America has modeled to the world ever since our founding, about what a constitutional republic looks like and what that means for democracy.
On civics education, what would you suggest that we do to improve upon that? And if you have any thoughts in mind of where you might see that happening?
Yeah, I think it's such an important challenge. In many ways, we've lost in our schools sort of the fundamentals of American history. And I think a lot about what are the aspects of history that inspire young people. And so often those are the stories of, the brave men and women who have done remarkable things for our nation. And too often now we've lost sight of that. We don't study sort of the great man and great woman view of history. And look, frankly, we also have moved away from teaching our kids what an exceptional nation America is. And we are certainly not perfect. And we attempt and strive to be better, to be a more perfect union constantly. But it's our constitutional framework and structure that people really, I think, need to spend more time understanding. And one thing I would just say, when you get elected to Congress, you come into Congress as a freshman member, there's a lot of time and effort put into things like appropriations boot camp, and they take us and they teach us how the appropriations process works, or how the taxation process works. And I think we need a Constitution boot camp. I think we need to make sure that, members of Congress understand and recognize where the legislative branch fits in, what our responsibilities and obligations are. And I think we ourselves could certainly benefit from that.
Let's take a step back and look at the global picture if we can. And Freedom House, in its latest report, has documented 16 years of decline when it comes to freedom in the world, more countries registering declines than gains. Do you have a sense of what's driving this global phenomenon where we're seeing a decline in freedom around the world and only about 20% of the world's population living in free countries?
I think there are a lot of elements that go into the decline. And I think that some of it has to do with the role of America in the world. And I think it's certainly not an accident that, since the end of World War II, we've seen an incredible spread of freedom, an incredible increase in economic and political freedom and prosperity and security. And the reason for that is because America has been the strongest and most dominant nation in the world, and because those are characteristics of our own political system. I think that you now have, among other threats, you have a situation where you have people in both the left and the right in American politics who believe in isolationism. Some call it isolationism, some don't. But it's this notion that America can be free and secure if we just simply withdraw within our own borders. That's been a fallacy every single time it has emerged in our political system, and it's very dangerous. And I think that what you're seeing today is the rise of China, a nation that clearly has global ambitions. And I think people need to understand that if we lived in a world where China set the rules, it would be a global surveillance state. There would be no freedom. You're also seeing, obviously, what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, and I think that the necessity of America and our NATO allies to stand with Ukraine is not just about Ukraine's freedom; it's about our freedom, and it's about demonstrating that the free world has not lost sight of how important it is to stand together, and I think that means we have to recognize the importance of hard power as well as soft power. President Zelensky recently said, "Freedom must be better armed than tyranny," and I think that what you're seeing today with respect to Russia and Ukraine absolutely demonstrates that.
To the people listening to this, how would you explain why it's in U.S. interest to support democracy, to support advancing freedom around the world? And what would you say are the best ways that we can do so with fledgling democracies?
Well, I think that there are many reasons why America must support freedom and free nations around the world. I think that certainly if you look at things like our own safety, our own security, our own economic prosperity, the fact that you have freedom of navigation, the fact that you have had relatively free trade, the fact that you've had more people rise out of poverty over the course of the last 75 years, in particular, under a system that values and defends and protects human freedom. It's crucial for our security. It's also right. We believe fundamentally in inalienable rights. We know fundamentally that is the form of government that works best, and it's also the form of government that is morally the right form of government. And we have watched tyranny rise. I mean, I do feel like I'm sort of, I've watched at the very beginning of my career working at AID in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union in 1989 and 90, working in the Bush administration on the Middle East in the early 2000s. And watching, moments where it looked like democracy really, the free nations of the world were coming together, democracy was ascendant. And I am concerned now. I think that we're at a period where the nations that threaten democracy are on the rise. But I would say that we have seen, certainly in the last several months, a real coming together of NATO, a real coming together of the EU, and an understanding, I think, again, a new realization that if we believe in and value our freedom, and if we're going to stand with others, then that requires that we do so with our allies globally, and that we dedicate the resources necessary for it.
Perhaps this gets to your constitutional boot camp, but when you think about a democracy, including our own, what do you think it has to deliver to keep itself healthy and keep the trust of its citizens?
Well, I think what it has to be able to do is defend the rights of our citizens. And I think that we have to remember that, our government doesn't give us our rights. Our government is supposed to protect our rights. And I think that we also have to recognize that the really unique moment we're living in history, and not take for granted as citizens that most people in most parts of the world throughout most of history have not lived in freedom. But we have to know that, as citizens, we have obligations, and those obligations, require that we defend our institutions. We not be bystanders. I mean, it really is a miraculous structure that our founders established. And, I was particularly struck in January of 2021 as the Congress was getting prepared for the counting of electoral votes. And we were certainly going through all of the debates about whether Congress could object to electoral votes. And when I went back and read the Federalist Papers, and read, Alexander Hamilton talking about why the founders didn't want the electors to meet in Washington to vote, and they didn't say Washington, they said in the Capitol, because they were very concerned about political pressure on the electors. Why they didn't want currently serving elected officials to be electors. Again, they were worried about the pressures of faction, the pressures of politics on electors. When you go back and you read, Washington's farewell address, or you read, there's a document that we saw recently. The members of the Select Committee were at the Library of Congress for a meeting 2 weeks ago, and the librarian brought out a number of their rare documents for us. And one that she brought out was a note that Abraham Lincoln wrote in 1864 in August. And he said, it appears increasingly likely that my administration will not be reelected. And he said, if that is the case, then it is my duty to so cooperate with the president-elect that I will make sure I do everything possible to preserve the Union, through his inauguration, at least. He didn't think the Union would survive McClellan's presidency. But those kinds of things, when you see how much our forefathers believed in and sacrificed for the perpetuation of our institutions, I really think of it as an obligation our citizens have to make sure we do the same, and that we understand the benefits and the blessings of democracy, and not think of ourselves as bystanders, hoping somebody else will do the job of preserving our institutions.
Well, I was just actually quoting the Federalist Papers to my 11-year-old last night. I don't know what that says about our household, but
it sounds like mine.
Good, I'm good company. One more question before I turn over to Bill to close us out, but somewhat inspired by the recent election of Viktor Orban to another term. But how should liberal democracies respond, their institutions, their leaders, when a leader whom they know does not respect institutions and the independent judiciary or a free press or the role of political opposition? How does a democracy and all the different facets within it respond to that?
Well, I think it's a very important question. And when actually during Bush 41 administration, there were discussions about Islamism and, how would you handle the election of Islamist governments, for example. And I think it was Ed Dirigian who said, basically, you don't want the next election to be the last election. And so if non-democratic individuals or organizations or parties use the election process to take power, then history shows that very quickly you don't have legitimate elections very much longer after that. And so I think that's incumbent upon us, frankly, both here at home in thinking about the people that we support and elect, and also as a nation, as we look to who we're going to support, what kind of alliances we're going to build overseas. And I think we have to be clear-eyed. It's easier to bury your head in the sand in the short term, in too many cases. And I think that's where danger lies. And I think that we have to be clear-eyed. Not every government we work with around the world is going to have the kind of liberal democracy that we believe in. Some will have it to a greater extent than others. But we have to be honest about those governments. And I don't think that Americans should be looking towards, Viktor Orban as any kind of a model. I think we got to be clear-eyed about who he is and what he stands for. And the same with Putin. And the extent to which you've had members of my own party continue to express neutrality as between Russia and Ukraine is very troubling. And the extent to which people haven't been clear-eyed about the need to reject Putin, the need to stand with Ukraine. I think that there's not a gray area with respect to that war.
So what role should political parties play in strengthening our democratic institutions?
Wow, it's such an important question. And I think that where we are today in our country, I am a conservative Republican, and those are the principles that I believe in. I also know that on both sides of the aisle, we have to elect serious people. And, I can look at my colleagues in the House, and there are people who aren't serious on both sides, and there are people who are serious on both sides. And I think that as voters, we need to think about that when we're going into the voting booth, and we need to think about the tremendous responsibility that we give to our elected officials. And you want to elect people that are going to be serious about that duty. And sometimes, I look at some of my colleagues, for example, on the House Armed Services Committee, who, people like Mikey Sherrill, Elaine Luria, Chrissy Houlihan, they're all Democrats. They're all veterans. Abigail Spanberger is another one. We're not on armed services together, but these are members I have tremendous respect for. I disagree with them on a number of issues, but I know that they care deeply for this country, and I know they take their responsibilities seriously. And so I would just say we need to elect people who are more committed to policy and to preserving our institutions than to being, social media stars. And we also need to be very clear that while parties should be big tents, we want as many people as possible in our parties. There are certain beliefs and opinions that are absolutely antithetical to anything that we are as Americans. And those are things like anti-Semitism, white supremacy, white nationalism, and parties, and my party in particular, needs to be able to say we reject those. Those are not part of our public discourse. Those cannot ever be part of what we stand for. No tent should ever be big enough that those views are acceptable.